theory is actually from his books, including the digital turn and also second digital turn and alphabet. And also last year he published another, I remember, an interesting book titled as The Beyond Digital. I think that is something important about automation in architecture discipline. So this year coming to Tongji, I think it's important, super important to have a brief introduction from Mario to introduce his theory. Actually, in 4 lectures, we record all these lectures and upload to Digital Futures platform and Billy platform. So we already have more than 850 lectures there. So it's actually a platform for the future PhD student and graduate student to reassemble the history, theoretical, and technology lectures to be the learning platform sharing by us to the whole world. So that is important culture we establish, especially for the digital futures and digital in architecture. And right now it's AI in architecture, AI for built environment and architecture design. So today, I think Mario will keep going on from his past 2 lectures, which I think briefly introduce the truth as a very important parallel in the technology theory of architecture. And also last time, I think it's important to talk about the customization and the industrialization during the modernism, I think, which play a very important role parallel to analyze why modernism was coming and such kind of industrialization is so important for us to understand why the architecture industry and also the practice theory and history will be established set up based on this kind of very special detour theoretical cruise during history. So let's welcome Mario to give the 3rd lecture to us for all the PhD candidates here. And I also would like to announce next time, it's a great honor for us to invite Mario Kapoor to make a public lecture in the main auditorium of Tongji CUP, because we'll have like undergraduate and graduate students, they all will take this course. And so looking forward, you can come next Tuesday, same time, in the main auditorium of CUP. So welcome. So the screen is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Make some adjustments real quick. Oh, now it's cleaner. Right. So, good. Thank you. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's late. And this is my 3rd presentation in a sequence of 4. So we already met twice online. Tonight we meet in person. I'm very happy to be here, and we shall be together next week as well. So now I can see you, whereas for the last 2 weeks you could see me, but I could not see you. So it will be also interesting for me to have some, meaning since I am in the same room, it will probably be easier to ask questions or to have some discussion at the end. Of course, I have no idea of who you are, what you know, and also language can be a problem. My English has an accent. Every English has an accent, but mine has an accent. And you all speak English as a foreign language, I understand. That may create some problem of comprehension. So do not hesitate at the end to ask questions. I understand that the lectures are being recorded. So one of the advantages of having a lecture as a recording is that if there is a passage that you are particularly interested in, and you missed it when I presented in the classroom because of noise or the accent or whatever, you can go back to the recording and listen to the passage you're interested in 2 or 3 times, which is what we learned to do during the pandemic. And I noticed during the pandemic, when all our classes were pre-recorded and then put online, and then we had a meeting for discussing online because we could not go at school, the students were actually way more reactive because as they could watch the lecture for 24 hours before the discussion session, and the lecture was recorded, that's one advantage of having a lecture on Zoom and as a recording. When I'm with you in the classroom, if you don't understand one sentence, you cannot stop me all the time, tell me, say that again. That wouldn't work. But if you are just watching it in your bedroom and there is one sequence that you have not understood, you can just go back, you listen to it again, perhaps even with subtitles, that actually helps. So anyway, we shall see that when you have some time to ask questions and to have some back and forth at the end of my presentation. But I continue from where I stopped at the end of my presentation last week. This is the same picture with which I started, the 3 ages of making: hand making, mechanical machine making, and digital making. And this diagram encapsulates in a single picture the spirit of the technical logic of the Industrial Revolution, mechanical machine making, the logic of economies of scale. We achieve economies of scale with the mass production of standardized parts. This curve is the curve said of a decreasing marginal costs. And as we already seen in details in the last 2 weeks, it means that if you're here and you make another copy, copy number 5, the next copy you make will cost less than the last copy you made. Each copy you make will cost less than the last copy you made, decreasing marginal cost. Or put it in another formula, the more copies you make, the cheaper each copy will be, which is the reason why in this system, if you make more, you spend less per unit. Bigger is cheaper. The permanent quest for scale, economies of scale. Bigger factories mean lower cost. Bigger market means cheaper goods, etc., etc. And as I explained to you, this is important to bear in mind because the digital doesn't work that way. In the digital, I don't have the slide here, but the curve is not a curve at all. It is an horizontal straight line. We call it flat marginal costs. It means that every copy you make will always cost the same, no matter how many copies you make, which means that there is no incentive for making more copies unless you need them, because if you make more, they will not cost less. Now, at the end of the last lecture last week, some of you in the audience asked a very pertinent question and said, how does this relate to the way digital architecture looks, to the way digital architecture has been looking for the last 30 years? And as we know, the digital architecture has already gone through several styles. It already looks different today from what it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. If we think that digital architecture, the digital turn in architecture started in the 90s, there is a first period in the 90s when everything was curvy and smooth. This is what we call the Deleuze connection, which someone mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the objective, the fold. This is what Greg Lynn called the blob. And this is what we call today digital streamlining, or the style of spline modeling. You know what splines are, and this is the time when everyone was making splines all the time. Now, since the early 2000s, Patrick Schumacher has introduced the term parametricism, which is to some extent problematic, but it refers to this style, the time when everything was smooth and curvy and streamlined, like an automobile, like an airplane, like a boat. This is the first digital style. Then there is the second digital style, which is the opposite. Everything that was smooth became rough. Everything that was continuous became discrete. We call that the style of a digital discretization. Everything which was smooth and continuous becomes broken down, fragmentary, disjointed, disconnected. This is the style of pixelization or excessive resolution, which in many ways is related to the new technology of big data and brute force computing, which became dominant as of 2010, 2015. This is period 2 in my chronology. And then there is possibly a period 3 in the making. We don't know yet because it only just started, but there is just the possibility that the use of generative AI may bring about a new way of imitating architectural styles of the past, something which is already happening. I cannot tell you now if it is a fad, which will, peter out and die soon, or if it will become a fully fledged digital style. It is too soon to tell. The jury is still out. So we shall see next year what has been happening. I can only say that for the time being, there is this possibility that a new digital look, a new digital style driven by generative AI, and by the way generative AI has a capacity to imitate and replicate more or less creatively architecture of the past, may have some influence on the way architecture looks. But all this first phase, second phase, third phase relates to the way that architectural theory has been taking positions inside this general framework, this technical logic, mass production or mass customization. This is the general techno-cultural framework inside which architectural theory has been developing different positions based on the different evolution of the technology. Now, to understand how architectural theory took positions inside this general techno-social framework, we should have a look at the chronology of computer science and the uses of computer science in architecture from the beginning. And the beginnings, well, everyone can put the beginnings in different period of history, but evidently talking about computation, I think that it's a matter of common sense to claim that the beginning is when electronic computers were invented. Modern Turing-complete electronic computers. Alan Turing defined the Turing machine in 1936. That's the idea of a modern computer where hardware is separated from software. He never built that machine because the war came, and then he was given another task, cryptography, etc., etc. But the first Turing-complete electronic computer came into service at the end of World War II. They were developed because they thought they would need them during the war. But in fact, the war finished sooner than the electronic computers became available, because the technology which brought World War II to the end was not the computer, it was the atomic bomb. If you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, you know how that happened. But anyway, that story, electronic computation, started in 1945-46. And from the very beginning, there were some ideas which came out of computer science, which had a huge cultural influence for architecture, for design, for the visual arts in general. Idea number one, cybernetic. Cybernetic is a very old term. It was invented by Norbert Wiener in 1948. So that's a long time ago. And it meant something very different from the meaning that cybernetic acquired later on. We shall get back to them. What was Wiener's original idea and how it evolved. But even more than cybernetic is important for us, the theory of artificial intelligence. Now, everyone today is talking about artificial intelligence, and you may think it's something new. Well, generative AI is new, but artificial intelligence as such, called that way, artificial intelligence is very old. because it was invented between 1956 and 1960. So 60 years ago or something. The first time the term was used was during a summer seminar at Dartmouth College. That's the milestone in the history of artificial intelligence, when the term was adopted for the first time. But the most influential ideas of how artificial intelligence should work and what it is came in the years that immediately followed, between 58 and 60. The protagonists were Marvin Minsky, who died only a few years ago. He lived a very long life, and Frank Rosenblatt, who had an accident and died soon after he invented the perceptron. But so this is when the idea of artificial intelligence first came to light. And these two ideas, cybernetic and artificial intelligence, were hugely influential in the visual arts in general, in culture, and in architecture already in the 60s. Then they declined in the 70s, then they were abandoned in the 80s, then some ideas came back in the 90s, and generative AI, as you know, revived artificial intelligence 2 or 3 years ago. But this is the timeline we shall start to have a look at more in detail next week. Because tonight, before we move to chronological timeline, facts and figures, who did what, when, and how, and why, I wanted to get back to some cultural, technical implication of this general framework I've been outlining for you, because that gives to you a larger picture. It allows us to put, this stylistical or artistical phenomenon in a bigger social technical framework. Because the technical logic of mechanical machine making, mass production, the economy of scale has been so pervasive in the world in which we live, around the world, in every country, for the last 200 years at the very least, that far from being just a technical logic, it has become almost a mentality, a way we look at the world, something we have incorporated in our mind. It was originally a way of making, but it is still, for many of us, for all of us, and for the entire global culture to this day, a way of thinking. We look at the world using categories which have been molded and crafted and shaped by this technical logic. The idea that bigger is cheaper. But if we make more, it should cost less. And also, oddly, that if we buy more, we should pay less. And think of how this is influential in the way we organize many trivial, anecdotal experiences in our daily life. Example, imagine that you want to buy a car. I presume that people buy cars here as they buy cars everywhere, and the experience is the same. You go to see a car dealer, you find a model that you like, and let's assume you actually want to buy a car and pay it all with a check. You pay the car and you drive away with the car. Imagine that that car costs, fictional number, $10,000. You make a check, $10,000. The car is yours. You sign the paper, document, contract, you drive out. So far, so good. What if, imagine, on the same day, in the same dealership, instead of buying one car, you want to buy 2 identical cars. And one for you and one for your wife, identical. So you say, the car, the listed price is 10,000. Good, good. But you know what? You speak to the dealer. I'm not going to buy one. I'm going to buy 2. So 10,000 and 10,000. If I buy 2 and I make the same check today for you, it's not going to be $20,000, right? It's going to be a bit less. Yeah. If you buy them, the 2 together, let's say A plus B is not 10,000 plus 10,000, 20,000. I give you a discount, a rebate, 18,000. You get it. You will ask for a discount. You will get a discount, a little discount. Imagine that you own a small company and you buy 5 identical cars on that same day, and they all cost $10,000 each. The bottom line is not going to be 50,000. It's going to be 45,000 because you will get a significant rebate. Imagine you own a big company and you buy 1,000 cars identical on the same day. Then you get a big discount. The more you buy, the less you pay. But why? Because these cars have already been made. They are already waiting for you to take them in the car park of the dealership. It doesn't seem to make sense. And yet, if you buy more, you expect to pay less, and you will pay less. Another example, now nothing to do with automobiles. Imagine you buy potatoes. You go to a grocery, you buy 1 kilo of potatoes, $1. I just make it up. I don't know how much potatoes cost. Actually, I do, but in another country. 1 kilo, $1. If you buy 10 kilos, you will not pay $10. You will expect to pay $8. If you buy 100 kilos, you have a big van, you buy 100 kilos of potatoes, you will not pay $100, you will pay significantly less. The more you buy, the less you pay. But why? Since potatoes, to the best of my knowledge, are not made in factories. They grow in the fields. And there are no economies of scale in the way you pick potatoes. And yet, if you buy more, you pay less. Another example, not with industrial goods, not with agricultural products, but with services. You want to make a booking for an hotel room, just as I did to come here a few weeks ago. And you check the price online, and it is, say, $100 per night. So if you want to stay 1 or 2 nights, you know the price is 100 one night, 200 2 nights, 300 a night. Sometimes the website tells you that if you stay a minimum of 7 days, the price goes down a little bit. If you stay longer, the price per night is less. But assuming you want to stay for much longer, you want that room for 1 month, then you don't look at the website anymore. You see what's the listed price for 1 week. Then you call the manager, say, oh, by the way, I am planning for a long stay. What's the price you're going to give me for 1 month? And the person says, let me speak with my management. Get back to me in half an hour. Then you call them back, and you will get a big discount. So if you buy more, you pay less. But why? Since an hotel room is not an industrial product. If you make, a car in a factory, the more you make, the less it costs. But in the case of services, why does this logic apply? Why do we all have this overarching frame of mind, a mentality, whereby we are all collectively persuaded that if we buy more, we should pay less, but bigger should always be cheaper? This started, that's the slogan, a long time ago. This is a story. The protagonist of this story, Frank Gilbreth, I already mentioned him 2 weeks ago because he was a friend and associate of Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor is the guy who invented Taylorism, or scientific management, which is the principle underpinning the invention of the moving assembly line. Taylor was an engineer, and Frank Gilbreth, this is his son, Frank B. Gilbreth Jr., was also an engineer, MIT trained, and is in the history books for having invented time and motion studies, which is a discipline which tries to rationalize the movement of the workers doing an artisanal job. Taylor was a mechanical engineer, whereas Gilbreth was an architectural engineer, and actually he made his living as a contractor and a developer. He owned a building company. And most of his work was about bricklaying. His company did bricklaying. And we are around 1905, 1910, and bricklaying was competed by concrete walls because making a wall in concrete was cheaper than making it with bricks. So he was trying to save his business by making his bricklayers more cost-effective than they would have been. So he went to his own building sites and he started to watch how his bricklayers worked. And he analyzed the time it took for each bricklayer to make each movement. And he calculated that a bricklayer, to put one brick in place in a wall, had to make 22 different motions. Pick the brick, and then separately pick the mortar, put the mortar in the brick, put the brick in the wall, hit on top to make the excess mortar spill out, clean it up, 22 motions, whereby to lay a brick took a lot of time. And he calculated that with some arrangements, for example, changing the position of the scaffolding, putting all the bricks closer to the worker, putting the mortar at a certain height to limit the motion of the arm, he could limit the number of motions needed to lay each brick from 22 to 4. So he could increase the efficiency of his bricklayer by a factor of 400%, which saved a lot of time, saved a lot of money, and also he claimed was good for the worker because fewer motions meant less labor and less fatigue. So this is the beginning of time and motion studies. Faster, fewer motions, which in the moving assembly line will become, to the limit, only one motion. The worker does only one motion, which is the fastest possible way of working. But Dilbert didn't limit his studies about rationalization and standardization. In this case, standardization of the movement of the human body. He didn't limit that to his business. He extended that to his family. And he calculated how much did it cost for him to have children. And as an engineer, which he was, he did all the calculation and he came to the conclusion based on cost analysis, how much it costs to feed, educate, put clothes on, medical care, et cetera, but the cheapest way of having children, maximizing the economies of scale in the creation of a family, was to have 12 children at 12 regular intervals of 12 months each. So one kid every year, which is what he did. He had 12 kids at 12 regular intervals. So when this drawing was made, there was one kid age 12, one 11, one 10, one 9, one 8. You would think that after that, system, his wife would die, whereas he died. His wife lived a long and happy life, and she became herself an engineer. So the story told in this book, Cheaper by the Dozen, is that they were driving around in New Jersey, where they lived with this car, and they were stopped at an intersection, and they had this car with him, Gilbert, his wife, 12 kids, and also a dog. And at the intersection, someone watched and said, "Hey, guy, what is that your family or a kindergarten that you have in your car? 12 kids? Are you crazy? What 12 kids? Nobody has 12 kids. You must be mad." I said, no, I'm not mad. I'm an engineer. I calculated that by having 12 kids, I can make each kid cheaper. That's the cost, what I have to spend to educate each kid. Example, which is recounted in the book, meaning cheaper by the dozen, is a slogan which is sometimes still used if you go to the grocery to buy eggs. One egg is $1, assuming, but eggs are cheaper by the dozen. If you buy 12 eggs, it's less than $12, it's $8, because you buy more, you pay less. The same for kids. If you have 12 kids, they will cost less. If you think of it, it does make sense because, kids grow, and so every year you have to buy a new pair of shoes, and so the shoes have to be discarded when they are still good. But you have a new kid who is growing, you can pass down a pair of shoes, so a pair of shoes is used 12 times for 12 different kids, you save a lot of money. But the example he gives is that at some point, one or two of his kids needed a minor surgery operation called tonsillectomy, meaning you take the tonsils out of your throat. It's generally, it was done to kids. I don't know if they still do it. And so he had to go to the hospital and explain to a surgeon that one or two of his kids needed to have this tonsil taken out. Said, how much does it cost? $100. Well, I have two kids. I have to do them well, if I do the same morning, instead of $100, let's say 150, I do them both. Said, well, wait, what if the entire family has the tonsils taken out? And so he make a deal with the surgeon. The entire family, including himself and wife, they all had the tonsils taken out the same day. So that he paid less for each, even those who didn't need it, but it was cheaper if you had it more. Even himself, he didn't need the operation and was already an old man, so he was sick for 1 month after that. This is the spirit of economies of scale. This is where it comes from. Now, I don't need to tell you that this technical logic does not apply anymore when we move to the digital domain, and particularly to the digital economy. It does not work that way. It is exactly the opposite. Now, the apps which I have on the screens are those that are common in the West, but what I discovered since I came here 2 or 3 days ago is that for each one of these apps, there is an equivalent app here, which has a different name, but works exactly the same way. And in fact, as far as I can tell, some of these apps were developed first here and then elsewhere, because for what I've seen, the digital economy is more advanced here than in several countries, particularly in Europe. But for example, this Zipcar is a way to, it has been around for 15 years, to rent a car for mini rentals, for a very short rental. I don't know, you're all young, so you never had the experience of renting a car before the digital age came, but I can tell you that until, say, 15 years ago, renting a car was a huge bureaucratic operation. Even if you could reserve the car online, starting from year 2000 or something, you still had to show up in person at the counter, sign a mountain of documents, show driving license, insurance, 7 credit cards, all certificates. It took 1 hour of paperwork. So nobody did all that hullabaloo to rent a car for less than 1 day. It was even not allowed. And again, the logic was if you rent the car for 1 day, it's $100. For 2 days, it's not $200, $180. For 3 days, it's not $300, it's $250. For 1 week, it's not $700, it's $520. The more you buy, the less you pay. With this app, which has been around in America since 2008, 2009, you choose the car online. The car are parked around in the city, as I presume the same happens here, and you can rent the car for 1 hour, if necessary, not sometimes even for 30 minutes. But the point is, if 1 hour costs $10, 2 hours cost $20, 3 hours cost $30, it's a flat rate. It costs the same no matter how long the rental is. This other app, Airbnb, which is very controversial in the West because people are using it. It's a way to micro-rent apartment. As you probably know, here as elsewhere, renting an apartment is a complicated operation. You have to apply. It takes months of paperwork, leave a deposit. With Airbnb, you can rent a house for 1 week, sometimes even for 1 day, sometimes even for 1 night. But the principle is the same, that when you have made your choice, it is a flat rate. If 1 day costs 100, 7 days cost 700. Now, so the principle, the old principle that if you buy more, you pay less, doesn't apply anymore here. There is a technical explanation for that if you want just a footnote, and it is due to what economists call the fixed costs or the administrative overhead, which is, in a nutshell, the cost of processing the transaction itself, the cost of the paperwork. assuming, which is the reason why the old system of rental had that logic. If it takes 1 hour to do the paperwork, that 1 hour applies if the rental is short or long. And so it makes sense to have fewer, bigger transactions to amortize the fixed cost. So this explains why if you rent for longer, the cost per day is less. But if you rent online, the cost is always the same. Why? Because the fixed cost, the administrative overhead, is almost zero, because it's not made by people on paper. It is an algorithm. It is online. It is automatic. It takes 1 second, a click of the mouse, just some bits of electricity. If the fixed cost is zero, you can process many very small transactions at no additional cost. That's the reason why in the old system, to use a credit card, you needed to have at least, a relatively big transaction to amortize the cost of the transaction itself. Until recently, you couldn't use a credit card for less than $100 or something. Whereas with the digital wallets that everyone here is using, and soon the entire world will, you can micromanage minute, very small, microscopic transaction, 1 penny, because the cost of the transaction is irrelevant. You don't have to take that into account because it is basically zero. This is the reason why in the digital economy, bigger is no longer cheaper, because the cost of the transaction is nothing. And so we can process many very small transactions at no additional cost. That's the difference between the way we did business and the way we do business now using digital tools. But so bigger is no longer cheaper. Think of what this logic means outside of retail, outside of commerce, outside of services, in the field that we are more interested in, the physical production of material goods. Imagine that you are an industrialist and you have learned the logic of economies of scale. You want to put yourself into the modern industrial logic. And imagine that your business is making teapots. So if you want to maximize the economies of scale in the mass production of a teapot, what should you do? First thing, you should standardize the teapot. You should design one single global universal teapot which can be used by everyone, everywhere, at all times. Just one model, ideally, so that you can make as many of them that you can maximize the economies of scale. The more identical copies you make, the cheaper each copy will be. So you don't want to have a catalog of 10 teapots or 100. No, just one teapot. If everyone likes that teapot and buys that teapot and needs that teapot, you can make so many of them that you will make them very cheap. First step, standardize one teapot for all, the universal global teapot. That's the design problem. Then the industrial problem. Where can you make that teapot for less? Then you should analyze the cost structure, labor, energy, raw material, real estate. You do all the calculations and you come to the conclusion that the cheapest place to build that factory is in India or in Vietnam, or in a place where all the equation, the formula gives the lower cost. When you build that there, your factory, be the biggest possible factory to make the biggest possible number of teapots. Problem 2 is solved, the biggest factory. Then you have to sell those teapots. So you need a fleet of airplanes and boats and trucks and trains to send your teapots everywhere. And then you need a market which is big enough to take in all your teapots. So the logic is bigger factories for cheaper goods. But a bigger factory needs a bigger market, because you need a market where your teapots can be sold. And historically, in the 19th century, your market was the market of the country you were in. So the paradox is that you cannot build a big factory if you are in a small country, because you will not sell enough teapots in that market. The market will soon be saturated. So historically, from the beginning of the industrial process in Europe, this is Europe in the 19th century, the countries are now different. The problem is countries were industrializing. To industrialize, you need to build a big factory, but a big factory needs a big market, and a big market needs a big country. Now, when this all started in the 19th century, some countries were already big enough. England was big enough, and France was big enough. They were already the size they are today. So were Spain and Portugal, but these four countries, known as the maritime powers, had an additional advantage. They had colonies, and colonies worked very well in this context because they provided a big market to sell the industrial products made in factories built in these countries. In the case of the teapot, think of the history of the United Kingdom. Tea came from India. So the boats brought tea from India to London, and the same boats brought teapots back from London to India. So you could, fire the factories and sell the teapots to the Indians who sold you the tea to make tea. So bigger countries for bigger factories for lower cost. Now, the problem was for countries who were not big enough and didn't have colonies, such as Italy and Germany. They were industrializing, but they could not achieve economies of scale because that's the logic. Bigger factory, bigger market, bigger country. What if your country is not big enough? Well, there are not many solutions to make your country bigger. The most evident solution is that you occupy the neighboring country and you become a bigger country. The problem is that if you occupy the neighboring country, you go at war, and you kill all the inhabitants of neighboring countries, being dead, they will not buy your teapot because they're dead. So capitalists soon realized that it was more convenient and cheaper to expand your country, not by war, but by custom unions. That's the history of Germany. All these very small German states, which remained independent in World War I, basically, had from the early 19th century a custom agreement whereby industrial products travel across the borders without paying custom duties. So it became an artificially bigger country, but again, big enough to pay for the cost of industrialization. A bigger country means bigger factory means cheaper goods. That is the logic. It starts in the factory and it ends up by determining the size of the country. The case of Italy is different because Italy didn't choose the custom union. All these little states, which made Italy at the beginning of the industrial age, were unified by war. So one country expanded militarily and occupied the rest. But you may know that in the history of the United States was already a very big country, which is why industrialization was progressing very swiftly. But there was an incident. In 1864, 65, some countries wanted to separate. It's known as the Civil War or the War of Secession. The South wanted to split up. It was a long and bloody war, which, as we know, the North won. The South remained attached to the rest of the country. And you know the story. The evident reason of the war, the ethical principle of the war was slavery, which was legal in the South and was forbidden in the North. When the North occupied the South, slavery was forbidden. But think of it in other terms. The factory of the North needed a bigger country to create the market for the goods they made. And so if the country had shrunk, that would have been a step back in the process of industrialization. Bigger factory need bigger markets need bigger countries. And I don't need to tell you that the digital does not work that way. It is once again, exactly the opposite. Let's go back to the example of the teapot, the global teapot, made in a global factory in a faraway country and then shipped by planes and trains and boats and trucks around the world. That global teapot, centralized, standardized, and mass-produced, is in principle not cheaper than a 3D printed teapot made by a fab lab at the corner of the street, where you need it, when you need it, as you need it, on site, on specs, on demand. Where you need it because the fab lab is local. When you need it because you don't stock the teapots waiting for the client to come, you 3D print it only when you need it. As you need it, because being 3D printed, you can customize the file. You download it, and it is made using local materials, because to make a teapot, you need clay, and clay is everywhere. And then you have local force, but it is a robot and someone operating the robot, and local energy, ideally renewable. And then you need the software, but the software is information, bits and bytes, which is downloaded from the internet. And let me tell you, it is cheaper and faster to download a file which tells the robot or the 3D printer how to make a teapot than to bring in a teapot from 70,000 miles away. So the idea of the Fab Lab was, the name Fab Lab was invented at the MIT in 2001 by a professor who is still there called Neil Gershenfeld. He was then teaching a class called The Way to Make Almost Everything. I think that was the title of the class. And this research group was called the Bits and Atoms Lab. Think of it, the Bits and Atoms Labs. Bits is software, information. And atoms means matter, it is fabrication. So information and fabrication. And his idea, the Fab Lab is a small, fabrication installation, which he imagined community-based and locally located. Because at the beginning, there was this idea that when 3D printing came and it became cheap around that time, there was the idea that everyone would have a 3D printer at home, just like you have a washing machine or a TV set. And when you need the teapot, you just print it on your, on your desk, a desktop 3D printer. Then it was realized that it doesn't really work that way, because unless you have some expertise, you cannot really use a 3D printer. Not everyone is capable of doing that. So the idea was to centralize some fabrication tools, robotics, 3D printing, milling, et cetera, in a local community-based fab lab or fabrication lab, where you can exploit the versatility of these tools. Versatility, meaning the same robot, which today makes my teapot, tomorrow can make a bicycle wheel. It doesn't really work that way, but in principle, it could work that way. And so since nobody needs a teapot every day and nobody needs a bicycle every day, the idea is the Fab Lab is there, it's versatile, someone is taking care of it. And it will take care of the fabrication need of a local community, providing, that was the idea. It didn't really work, meaning it was visionary and utopian. Some were built, particularly not in America, well, this one was evident in England, but they didn't really catch on because there was no community to sustain them. It was also more than 20 years ago. So with today's technology, perhaps it would work, but today's technology is being used in a slightly different way. This is the idea of a distributed robotic microfactory, which is the idea that, think of it, the Fab Lab, the idea of 20 years ago is that you bring people to the machine. Here, you bring the machine to the people, meaning you put the machine inside a container, just as you are doing, because this is Gilles, but Philip has a very similar project, and you bring the technology where you need it, which in the case of building is exactly what we should do, because building starts one day here. So you bring the technology where you need it, and when you're done, you bring it to another place. but the technical logic is the same. Distributed robotic microfactory is, in a sense, an automated artisan shop, which for building is probably exactly what we need. Now, none of these ideas, the idea that we pass, so conceptualize the bigger picture. The old world, economies of scale. Bigger is always cheaper. Bigger factories, bigger markets, bigger countries. Think of the geopolitical implication of this. Now, in today's world, a new economy without scale, where bigger doesn't bring any economic advantage, where scale does not matter. The flat marginal cost economy. In the old world, the permanent quest for scale. A bigger factory is cheaper than a smaller factory. A bigger market allowed us to have cheaper goods. A bigger country allowed us to have bigger factories, hence bigger markets, hence cheaper goods. Bigger means not necessarily better, but certainly cheaper. This is not true anymore. When we shift from the mechanical to the digital way of thinking, we must abandon not only the technology, but also the mentality of the permanent quest for scale, and realize that in the digital world, as in the old artisanal world, the pre-industrial world, scale is irrelevant. Scale does not matter. Now, these ideas are not particularly new. The first to set them forth, more or less as I just presented them to you, was Bill Mitchell in this book, which he published in 1995. City of Bits. Bits, we know what they are. Space, place, and the info band. What's the info band? Well, we are in 1995, and Bill Mitchell was at the time the Dean of Architecture at the MIT, a visionary. He had already contributed to digital technology and computational design, to space grammar, etc. When he published this book, he had the feeling that the internet was the next big thing. Mind you, we are in 1995, and the internet is a quite new technology. Now, technology as such, as the ARPANET had been around for a while, but it was only used by the military or in America and in Europe by some universities. Just to remind the chronology, the internet as such had been around for a while, but the popular use of the internet and the commercial use of the internet, meaning the possibility of surfing the web, going from one server to another without having to retype a new address every time, but only came with the invention of the World Wide Web, the HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You click and you seamlessly transfer from one server to another, and you don't even notice it. You surf the web. The expression surfing the web became fashionable around this time, mid-90s, but the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, was invented in Geneva by Tim Berners-Lee in 1990, as a way to facilitate scholarly and scientific information among scientists. Just an anecdotal footnote. When Tim Berners-Lee was inventing the internet in Geneva, I was living and teaching in Geneva myself. And of course, I didn't even know who Tim Berners-Lee was. Many years later, in fact, only a few years ago, I retrieved the original paper, which Tim Berners-Lee printed, with their first technical explanation of the functioning of the HTTP, the foundation of the World Wide Web. Without that, we wouldn't be where we are. And that document is printed on stationery of the university. There is no address, but there is the telephone number in Berners-Lee, which was my telephone number minus 2 digits. So I have to assume that Tim Berners-Lee was inventing the internet within walking distance from my office. I may have met Tim Berners-Lee at the cafeteria of the university. So meaning an invention was being invented next door to my office, and I found out 20 years later. So that's about being at the right place at the right time. Doesn't really, you don't really notice. But so in 1995, 1996, the internet was already used by universities. Just another milestone. Amazon sold its first book on the internet in the summer of 1995. And the company was called, as still it is called, Amazon.com. So the name of the company is the URL, its address on the internet. So that was only just starting. But Bill Mitchell, who didn't even have a name for the internet, because the Infoban is the internet. But at the time, people still call it this information superhighway. The term internet was not yet, the chosen term to determine what today we call the internet. This is what it meant. The Infoban, meaning the information superhighway, goes in. Telephone workers installing fiber optic cabling. This is Boston, 1995. And the story he tells is that, let me have a look at the time. Yes, we are not late. The story he tells is that due to the rise of the internet, urban life is going to change forever. And there is a page in the book where it tells the story of, think of what you're doing if you are in in any European city or in Manhattan or in Boston. In the morning, you leave to go to work. And first thing you do is you walk out and you buy a newspaper at a newspaper kiosk. And say, well, we still do it, but soon the newspaper kiosk will disappear because we shall read the newspaper on the internet. You say, really? What does it mean? What is it? Then you say, first thing. Second thing, you need to take some money at the bank. There is a bank branch at the corner of the street. But soon there will be internet banking. And so that branch will disappear because the transaction that now require you to be there in person will be replaced by the internet. And then there is a travel agent on the opposite side of the street, where you go and buy a ticket for an airplane ticket. The way they sell it to you is that they connect with a remote terminal to the server of the airline, and then they sell the ticket to you. But soon, with the internet, you can do that yourself from home. So that office soon will shut down. And then there is the post office, where you go into the letters in the mail. But soon, email will be the dominant tool of communication and will replace all others. And then there is a bookshop, where you go and buy a book. But soon, all books will be electronic books. And so the physical bookshop will no longer need to exist. And then there is the record shop. You young people have never probably seen a record shop. When you buy a physical piece of, plastic or metal, which was a vinyl or a CD, as it was used at the time, you buy a physical thing, you put it in a player, you listen to the music. That's the way people listen to music in 1995. But Nietzsche says, soon, music is information, just like money is information. Just the money in the bank, you can access it from the internet. Music, you will download it from the internet, and the physical store where you buy a physical piece of metal or plastic which contains the music will disappear. He didn't anticipate that the technology that would make that possible would not be the download, but streaming, because the technology was not yet there. And then he said students will go to the library, but soon all the books of the library will be online, so the building of the library will be unnecessary. And then you go to work. When you've done all that, you go to work. But most of the work, which is about processing information, probably does not require you to be in a specific physical place if you can have access to the internet. And so it comes to this conclusion. Mind you, it's 1995. Perhaps the time has not yet come to say farewell to those vertiginously vainglorious corporate monuments, it means skyscraper, that have defined the great downtowns of the 20th century. It's talking about office buildings. They no longer seem so inevitable. Given a choice, many of us may prefer working with a net, at home. At home. Now, in 1995, nobody had ever seen this, but he knew what he meant. And today we do. The domestic living room is emerging as a major site at which digitally displaced activities are recombining, regrounding themselves in the physical world. Not just in the homes of, well, electro-yappies, digitarati, cheap-head hobbies, means nerds, and this is what it means. In many places now, news, entertainment, education, work, shopping, banking, lots of general social interaction are starting to flow in and out through small, housebroken electronic boxes. It meant the modem or the router. In 1995, everyone said, I'll believe it when I see it. It's never going to happen. And indeed, for many years, it didn't really happen. Well, of course, Amazon has grown, and in every country, the digital economy, but the revolution, the idea that the principle of a modernist city, think of it, where there is a part of the city where you work, but you do not live. A part of the city where you live, but you do not work. A part of the city where you go shopping, but you do not live and you do not work there. And then there is a system of transportation whereby you're always going back and forth between the different zoning. We call it zoning, the modernist zoning. Residential, industrial, business, retail, different parts, specialized, concentrated, economies of scale. You travel all the time. This, he claims, is going to fall apart due to despatialization. Activities that are migrating out of physical space to reconstitute themselves in the digital space, in the internet, in cyberspace, as we said at the time, and now today people say in the metaverse, but it's the same, out of physical space into cyberspace, which means cities will no longer function the way they did. So the way we used to build cities, the modernist way, zoning, separation, concentration, standardization, economies of scale, all the residential here, all the industrial here, all the business here, all the retail here, all the movie theaters there, all this is probably going to be made technically obsolete. We said it in 1995, and for many years people said, you see, it's never going to happen because we like the way we live so much, but we are never going to give it up, even if it would make economic sense. And then something happened, which nobody had anticipated, of course. In March 2020, the entire global infrastructure of the global economy shut down in the space of a weekend. And then we realized that the only thing we still had was the internet, which was still functioning. And anecdotally, let me tell you two little stories I know. When the shutdown came in Europe in March 2020, one of my colleagues, Manuel Garcia, whom you probably know, was associated with Gilles Rexin. He had a small private fab lab. It was not a fab lab because it was his own fabrication shop in Spain, in his hometown, where he made experiments, but he also made money by using robots to produce stuff outsourced by Zaha Hadid in London. So they made tableware, spoons, plates, this kind of stuff. And he was there working in his fabrication lab when the pandemic came. And the shutdown came and he couldn't travel back to London. He had to stay there. Then he realized that nobody needed the plates for Zaha Hadid, which couldn't have shipped to London anywhere. However, there was an hospital in town which urgently needed PPE, personal protective equipment, which was impossible to find on the market because the it was generally imported from other countries, and the transportation network had been shut down. So the space of a weekend, he converted his robots from making silverware for Zaha Hadid in London to making PPE, personal protective equipment, plastic screens from a town hospital which needed them. And he delivered them himself by bicycle. Local, this is, and another friend of ours, Jenny Sabin, did exactly the same at Cornell, exactly at the same time. The history is better documented because it was on a more professional scale. Cornell University has a big hospital in Manhattan, Cornell Hospital. And the hospital in Manhattan, as everywhere else, couldn't find personal protective equipment. And Jenny Sabin had her lab in upstate New York, and the same. The space of a weekend, she converted all the machinery she had for experiment with students, making bricks or whatever, and she converted everything to making PPE, which was validated, medically certified, and shipped to the hospital which needed them. Because this is what digital making can do. It can make stuff where we need it, when we need it, as we need it. You change the software, and the same robot which made silverware for Zaha Hadid on Friday, on Monday, they can make PPE, personal protective equipment, for a local hospital which needs them. This is the versatility which digital making affords us, and also the idea that since these shops, this mode of fabrication can be adapted so easily, it has the potential of being a fully localized production. We make the stuff we need where we need it. So we do not need to transport it, which during the pandemic we couldn't do. But even when we can do it, as we know, transportation has a huge carbon footprint. So the less we can do with transportation, the better it is for the environment. And as we all know, another thing which we discovered during the pandemic is that teaching online is possible. I don't mean it's fun, because most of the time it isn't, but if necessary, when needed, with precautions and with, a rational approach, it can work. Now, the irony is that the technology we used in March 2020 to go online had been around for 20 years, but it was never used. The first experiments for online teaching are dated and documented from 1993, 1994, 1995. The MOOCs, massive open online courses, launched by the MIT, Harvard, etc., in year 2000, they were never popular because people thought it was second-class education and you lose the campus experience, etc., etc. So the technology was there, but for ideological reasons, or for many other reasons, we decided we would not use it. When we had to use it, we discovered, surprise, surprise, that actually it works. So the question is, why did we not start to use it a few years earlier? I had to learn to teach online the space of a weekend in March 2020, because my university shut down on Friday, and on Wednesday we had classes. And they told us, you teach them online. How? Nobody knew it. We all learned by trial and error the space of a weekend, and we realized it was not difficult to learn. And with some, when we became more experienced, we could actually make it work. This is a seminar at Yale in the April of 2020. Peter Eisenman, whom you see on the screen, was then 89 years old. He's in the country house in Connecticut, and you see on the screen me, I was in London, Kurt Foster, who actually died only a few months ago in his apartment in Manhattan. Peter Eisenman, age 89, he taught this lecture as if he had been doing that all his life. Whereas until the week before, he didn't even know, nobody knew what Zoom was. We all discovered it on that week. And then the first time he had to do it, he did it as if it was the most natural thing in the world. So the question is, why did you wait, so long to do something? Now, again, anecdotally, do you recognize this lady, this girl? I don't know if she was popular here. Her name was, what was her name? Greta Thunberg. Does it ring a bell? You've heard her name. She was the icon. She was a teenager. Hold on. Forgot to take off my sweater. Now I see her on a sailing boat. I realize I should have done it sooner. In 2018, this Swedish teenager, she became a protagonist of the teenagers' revolt against environmental decay. And she became an activist for environmental protection. She founded a movement called Extinction Rebellion. Teenager, really young people from high school, not from university, demonstrating for the environment and against, et cetera, carbon footprint. She became so popular, but so popular that at some point in 2018 or something, she was invited to go and explain the environment to the Pope in Rome. And she went by bicycle, I think, because she didn't want to travel. But then in 2019, I think when this picture was taken, she was invited to give a talk on the environment to the United Nations in New York. That is the time when this girl was a consultant to the BBC, and there were talks of universities that wanted to give her a professorship at the age of 60. That didn't happen. But she gave a talk on the environment to the General Council of the United Nations in Manhattan, and she had to go from Stockholm, Sweden, where she lives, to Manhattan, and she went by sailing boat. The 16-year-old climate activist arrived in New York on Wednesday in a zero carbon emission sailing boat, completing a 15-day voyage from Britain to take part in the United Nations Climate Summit. She speaks. It was a bit rough sometimes, but it went incredibly well. And I didn't feel seasick, so I was extremely lucky, she told the reporters. Now, evidently, she invented the expression flight shaming. I don't know if you've heard it. Shame and blame and shame the people who fly too much, because by flying from one place to another, you destroy the carbon, the ozone, something, and contribute to the carbon footprint, you destroy the environment. So to avoid flying, do as she does. Instead of taking a plane from Stockholm or to the United Nations, take a sailing boat. 2 weeks on a sailing boat. Now, I don't know what happened to her. She's still around or something. If you see her, see someone looks like her now, years later, she may look a bit different. But if you meet her, tell her, if you have the occasion, the alternative to air travel is not sailing boat travel, it's Zoom. In case she doesn't know. Meaning, Zoom is cheaper, faster, safer than 15 days on a sailing boat. And then, meaning, yeah, a sailing boat has no carbon footprint because a sailing boat, but think of the carbon footprint of yourself staying alive for 15 days. That's your carbon footprint of your living body. And so, and the people on the boat. So I don't know if at the end of the day, it was even in terms of pure carbon footprint, you consider the time, the carbon footprint you produce by being 15 days on a sailing boat is probably, at any rate, Zoom would probably have been, no doubt, cheaper, safer, et cetera, because this is the point. We have been saying for 30 years that digital mass customization is cheaper, faster, smarter, more environmentally sustainable than the mechanical mass production of industrial goods. Meaning, a fab lab is cheaper, faster, smarter, more environmentally sustainable, but a big factory. The fab lab at the corner of the street is better than the huge factory in Thailand or in Vietnam. And we have also been claiming that the electronic transmission of information, meaning Zoom, or even a phone call, is cheaper, faster, smarter, more environmentally sustainable than the mechanical transportation of people and stuff. So Zoom is better than an airplane or even a sailing boat. The pandemic has proven not so much the unsustainability of the old system. We always knew it was unsustainable on the long term. It has proven the viability of an alternative system. The pandemic has proven that an alternative exists. Because when we had to find alternative ways, because we were obliged to, due to the emergency, we did. Not that we liked it, but when we had to, we did. We did because we had to, but we also did it because today's technology, allows us to do that. Hence, to go back to my original diagram, since the modern mechanical industrial world, the technical logic of mass production, economy of scale, and standardization is falling apart, and it doesn't work anymore globally in any country around the world. The alternative to the demise of this is not falling back into this, going back to the Middle Ages, to the same mode, it's to leap forward to this, to our digital future or digital futures, which is your term, which is probably, whether we like it or not, the only future we have.